Vulnerability is how do you actually just be open with what you know and what you don't know and be confident that that's actually a strength to be able to declare like I'm unsure about this. And that's where like alchemy is created in my mind of when we're just as clear as what we don't know or we're open with what we don't know as much as we are what we know, it provides the opportunity for better collaboration, more perspective, and ultimately, I just think better output.
You're listening to Prospecting on Purpose, where we discuss all things prospecting, sales, business, and mindset. I'm your host, Sara Murray, a sales champion who's here to show you that you can be a shark in business and still lead with intentionality and authenticity. Tune in each week as we dive into methods to connect with clients, communicate with confidence, and close the deal. Wallin is a tech and media executive who has built and led teams across strategy, production, and operations in the marketing and communications space. She has worked across the globe focused on creating scalable go-to-market solutions that keep creative excellence at the forefront without compromising local nuance. Her ability to balance the strategic with the tactical is inspiring to me, and I am excited to have her on the show to discuss her journey and the future of work. And welcome to Prospecting on Purpose.
Thank you, Sarah. Hopefully, I can live up to that intro.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited. And because we have an entertainment executive in our midst, our icebreaker question today has to be, what is a popular TV show or movie that you've never seen?
So I have a funny story about this. Like years ago, I was like at a work happy hour and this question got asked. And my answer was Friends, and everyone at the table had that face, like, "You've never watched Friends?" And so I went and watched every Thanksgiving episode that year at Thanksgiving, and I have now watched some of it. I haven't watched all of it, but I think if I'm gonna answer today in terms of never seen an episode, and I have to be honest, I'm kind of embarrassed about it, Game of Thrones.
Oh, okay. Well, I feel like Game of Thrones is a little bit more acceptable because it's a really big commitment. Friends, I feel like is so easy breezy. How have you never seen it?
I know. I feel like at this point too, I've just missed the boat. Like I keep hearing it hasn't aged super well here and there. So it's kind of like, I'll move on to like Abbott Elementary or I don't know, something else.
It's funny to watch TV shows like Friends now too, because most of the plot lines are just wouldn't even be a plot line with the evolution of the cell phone.
Yeah.
Half
Uh-huh.
of the episodes would not exist if they just had cell phones.
Right. Or like I was watching I was talking to somebody about like an old How I Met Your Mother episode of being on the subway cart on the Upper West Side that's above ground and like anybody who's been in that situation you like try to get your text message out before you go underground. I mean, lots of metro systems around the world now have Wi-Fi on them. So it is funny to think back of like, oh, that actually may not be an issue these days.
Well, no pressure, but I would champion you finishing the show Friends. I mean, just for closure.
Okay. I'll keep you updated. Maybe that's a 2023 goal.
You'll have to report back. So let's get into it. You joined Netflix at a very interesting time in the company's history. So I would like to start there.
Yeah, so I started about a year before House of Cards premiered and launched on the service. So beginning of original content, kind of at the they had just launched in Latin America, but really like international expansion starting. So kind of like the things I focused on kind of came into a lot of ambiguity. Like it was like just everybody sprinting, doing a million things, and just trying to go as quickly as possible as streaming as a category becoming more and more mainstream, right? Really focused on kind of shifting consumer perspective and mindset from streaming being kind of like watching TV and film over the internet being a fringe kind of behavior, but much more mainstream. And how do you define that and kind of establish that? And then also just focusing on international strategy. So worked across lots of different markets, ultimately moving to Singapore and overseeing kind of the building out of the teams in the office out in Asia Pacific, around establishing Netflix and how to kind of figure out how we fulfill the needs of consumers all over the world.
Wow. Okay. So I would be curious, what were some of the initial challenges that you and your team encountered when you're trying to launch and create, users, early adopters to understand what Netflix was and to really understand streaming?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 key like, if I think about just early days of just focusing on, like, the US market, it was really getting people to take streaming entertainment seriously and a subscription video on demand service, an SVOD service, like, which is so funny to think now because it's just so part of our lives across the board, and there's so many different streaming services now with really great content, but, like, a little bit over 10 years ago, just it wasn't a thing, and trying to get people to talk about and this was a big thing for us, is how do we get people to talk about what to watch on Netflix the same way they talk about what's in the movie theater or what's on TV tonight, and really kind of normalizing the destination of the internet for as an entertainment need. And then globally, entertainment is personal. Like I think we all connect with film and TV. We just discussed and debated 2 sitcoms from a decade ago, right? And it still feels so relevant in many ways. And that personal piece of it is important. And so I think, a company, a US based company, establishing a global business and trying to produce content all over the world, really, how do you kind of build the trust with consumers, that you're here to provide and enable, as opposed to anything else, and not being the big bad American company kind of coming to squash culture or other things, right?
Mhm. A lot of challenges I would not have thought of and to really unpack. When I think about when I first started understanding what Netflix was and starting to use the service, for me personally, there was this huge fear of missing out. You guys did a really good job creating that FOMO effect where I had to watch a show quickly so that nobody would spoil it for me. That was something that was a big shift in terms of how we consumed entertainment too, right?
Yeah, well, it's funny you bring that up because one of our early things in that kind of trying to establish, like, what Netflix was and this new, like, consumer behavior of watching internet, and to your point, like, one of the big differentiators for Netflix was all episodes at once. So, House of Cards or Orange is the New Black or whatever show is going out, but it's you put the control in the consumer's hands and letting them decide how fast or how slow they want to watch it versus it being dictated by the business. And that was a huge shift, as you mentioned. And one of the complicated aspects of that, though, is then getting into how that affects people. And to your point of like spoilers, I have to watch it so I don't get spoiled and those kind of things. Like one of my favorite projects in the early days was us trying to figure out like that true business challenge around how do we reshape the conversation around spoilers so that we don't become public enemy number one, but we really are kind of more enabling people to watch. And for me, and I think I've told you this before, like I read the last page of the book. I'll read all the synopsis of every episode before I jump into something. Like I to me, it's the journey, it's not the destination. So I don't actually care. I think the White Lotus, the episode just premiered this past weekend, and that's the first show in a long time. I was like, oh yeah, I'll watch this with everybody else.
So I have not seen White Lotus yet, and I now have this urgency to watch it because I don't want people to spoil it, and I don't even have a big desire to watch it. And okay, on that same thread, I want to ask you a question about spoilers as an expert. What is the proper etiquette in terms of duration of time has passed? Like, could I spoil the end of Game of Thrones for you? What is the appropriate time?
I mean, I think if you spoiled it for me, it's my own fault because how long has it been since that finale aired? I feel like once something's out in the world, personally, it's kind of free game. But I also am thoughtful of the fact that there are a lot of people who don't like to be spoiled. So I try to, temper and gauge the situation before I dive into anything. But that's my expert opinion if we're gonna say that.
So you moved to Singapore. How long were you in Singapore?
I was there for about 5.5 years.
Oh, okay. When you were in Singapore and the parent company is in the United States in California, and you're launching in all different areas of the world, how are you maintaining the continuity across all of those different teams? I mean, you were really the ultimate remote workers in that type of sphere. How do you maintain connection with your whole team across the globe while traveling and working remote?
I mean, I think that success in that comes from being like highly, highly aligned on your macro strategy and goals. As long as that's clear, I'm a firm believer that the way in which you fulfill, like you hire teams and people to be able to get to fulfill that goal. So, if you understand your goal, if you understand where you're headed, that alignment drives most of the continuity you need to be successful. And so, one of the things that I personally did, and I even before I moved to a regional office with Netflix, I was based in Los Angeles, and the rest of my team was based in San Francisco. And it's a shorter distance; it's the same time zone, but it's amazing how hard it can be aligned even across that piece of it. And so where I see the success and where I think the most important thing is like how do you define like your communication approach as a team and as a group and holding everybody accountable to whatever that kind of framework is and just being really really hyper clear on your goals and your purpose, because the reality is if you've done a good job at hiring and you've got strong teams that know their craft, they know their market, they know whatever it is you've hired them for, they're going to probably know the best way in which to fulfill that goal. So, and then ultimately when you get to that end point and you check in or midpoint, you're like, okay, yep, let's keep going.
Okay, that's helpful. When you're hiring and building people that are experts at their crafts, what are you thinking about when you're building your teams? How are you leveraging different strengths? What is your team building process?
Something that I reflect on a lot is the bigger a business gets, and even just it could be a small business and just the how quickly the world changes, like from a technology perspective, et cetera. Things get complex fast. And so with that, when I'm thinking about like my own personal skill set, but then also the skill set of the people that I want to build a team around and with, how do I focus on being really clear on what success looks like and what will make a successful person, but then also being really thoughtful and realistic about the fact that like rarely do you find unicorns and rarely are you a unicorn. Like we all have things we can work on. We all have great strengths, but also weaknesses, right? And so what I love to do and what I really try to do is how do I hire a diverse team that has lots of different perspectives and also probably kind of, if there's four different things I'm looking for in a manager, person one might be really high marks on A, person two might be really high marks on B, but like that's okay because I actually think what that does is facilitate an environment where people have to lean on each other and people can learn from each other, but then also people have the ability to teach and to grow and to also lead in their own right. And so for me, it's really like, how do you find the balance of skills you need for success, to be able to drive the work forward, but also to kind of empower your team?
As a team leader, you're talking about different strengths from your teammates and different perspectives and different strengths. This person has this skill set, this person has this skill set, and they all have the ability to lead in their own right. Are you, as their manager, putting them in position where they're able to shine in their strengths, or are they having to do it organically and step up, or is it reading between the lines? Walk us through that a little bit, please.
Yeah. I mean, I think that the special sauce is a mixture of that formal and informal. So, how do you, as a leader of people, create environments and create opportunities for people to lead? How do you kind of relinquish and step back and let other people step forward and being really thoughtful about that, whether it be who manages your weekly team agenda or how topics get put into a meeting for discussion or debate, like how do you like kind of empower or open up the ability for people to formally kind of engage that way. And then I think there's also an informal piece of it, right? And I think there's two pieces where, how do you coach from behind? Maybe you're in a meeting, a one-on-one meeting with a manager, talking through some things, and you're like, oh, Sara is actually, she just talked to me about a very similar topic that she's working through. Will you guys go connect with her and go discuss, right? And kind of helping kind of massage that and push that. And I think naturally what happens is people get more and more comfortable asking for help, but also providing help. And actually, that like collaboration, I think, is really motivating and exciting for people. And that kind of just helps that informal even speed up. So I think it's a mixture. And I think it's on a team manager to be really thoughtful of how they are clear about the formal opportunities, but then also how they kind of massage the informal to kind of naturally, organically happen.
That's really great, Anne. And I like your comment about giving permission for people to ask for help. You're putting your team in that safe space to do that. What other areas as a leader do you think are important to make sure that the teams feel safe when they're approaching leadership for help or for
Yeah.
offering feedback?
Yeah. And it's funny because I feel like asking for help and like the hesitation around it, and maybe even, dare I say, like the faux pas people feel about like, is it okay, is something I've heard so much over particularly the last 6 months from people who are early and new in their career to CMOs that I know, of this idea of like, how do we just like create the spirit of like people feeling comfortable to ask for help, because honestly we all need it and we're all willing to give it. And it's interesting how willing people are to lean in and be like, what can I do for you? And yet it still takes humans so long to be like, let me admit. And I think on that, like, one of the key things is how do you make vulnerability an asset to work versus it being kind of a demarcation for people. Um, and I think I want to be super clear that when I say vulnerability, I don't mean you have to be an open book. You don't have to tell everybody everything about from 10 years old onward. I personally am not one of those people. I am open and warm, but I'm quite guarded about my personal life, and I've just always been that way. Other people aren't, which is also fine. But I think that for a lot of people, they hear the word vulnerability and they instantly go like, "Oh, nope, I'm unwilling to tell you about my family," but that's not what vulnerability at work to me is. Vulnerability is, how do you actually just be open with what you know and what you don't know, and be confident that that's actually a strength to be able to declare, like, I'm unsure about this. And that's where, like, alchemy is created in my mind, of when we're just as clear of what we don't know, or we're open with what we don't know as much as we are what we know. It provides the opportunity for better collaboration, more perspective, and ultimately, I just think, better output.
I appreciate you saying that. I realized something pretty early on in my career. I've always sold really complex product through very complex sales channels, and it's easy to make mistakes, and I would make mistakes.
Mhm.
One of the things that I realized quickly is that I would make a mistake and I'd turn to a colleague and say, "Oh man, I just made this mistake. Please don't do it. It sucked. I would never want one of my teammates to go through that." And it just really cracked me wide open in understanding that admitting mistakes was a act of leadership.
Yeah.
I never felt like I was less than. I think people appreciated it because it prevented them from making the mistakes and it moved the team forward and the company forward. It helped set me up as someone who would be approachable if people made a mistake, if they needed help, we could understand how to course correct and fix it.
Yeah.
So, with people management, I have a two-part question here. In your role, how are you sharing feedback with your bosses? And then how are you giving your direct reports or their direct reports the opportunity to approach you with feedback? I'd like to understand some tools on how to be more comfortable with accepting and giving feedback.
I'm all about, like, how do you create frameworks and approaches that drive towards objectivity as much as you possibly can versus anything else. And I think particularly when it comes to um, feedback or debriefing or trying to like unpack what went right and what went wrong on a project, the biggest mistake is getting emotional or personal. And to me, like, how do you like, that's the piece that I think is super crucial is, how do you create tools and like some of the things that I think are super easy is if it's project based, being dogmatic about kind of debriefing wells, not wells, post project wrap, right? And getting it all on paper, having it be raw and messy, discussing it, debating it, having kind of creating that environment of talking through all those different pieces. And then the key piece that I think a lot of the time we miss is okay, you now have this laundry list of wells, not wells, you've debated, you've discussed, you were probably frustrated, you were also happy, all those different pieces, and then you move on. And like the most important thing after that is like, what are you taking away and how are we defining that? And how are we collectively aligning that those are the key takeaways for us to be better tomorrow? And so I always kind of push for, have those debrief sessions no matter what, big and small. They can be 10 minutes, they can be an hour, whatever you need given the project or whatever's going on. And then writing down on paper because I think that action is important or typing it in a Google Doc, whatever you want to do. What are your three takeaways? What are the three actionable things that you've all collectively decided like these are the actionable pieces of feedback that we can go apply to whatever we do next. And then how do you hold yourself accountable to that over time? And so I think that becomes super important of just like creating those kind of again more formal approaches to kind of keeping yourself and your teams and your colleagues all in check as you move forward. And then you always have something to look back to. And then I think there's also just the reality of we are humans and we are emotional beings. And so um, I think when it just gets down to kind of one-on-one personal interactions and just partnership, the most important thing is how do you as a leader, and whether you create or strive to create an egalitarian group where like, yes, you might be a leader, but like we're all equal, et cetera, there's still a hierarchy. And I think in that case, it's the responsibility of the person who's most senior to be kind of setting the stage for actively and directly asking for feedback, asking people's opinion, creating the environment where people are invited to invest and are invited to share. Because if you don't ever do that or signal that, people won't. And like depending on who you're working with and where what their background is, how they were raised, where they live, like the degree of comfort to kind of just steamroll and push ahead will shift. But the reality is everybody is the same where like if you don't feel like you're in an environment where you can be heard, you're not going to engage. And so I think that's what the most important thing a leader can do is just being really direct and not mincing words and asking for feedback and input from your team so that you're signaling that.
I love that. And when I think about this entire conversation, to me, you're giving us some real tangible assets to take with us. We're going into 2023, we're kind of out of the pandemic and we're in this weird spot as a global culture when it comes to work. What is your take on the future of work? What does it look like, or what could or should it look like?
I don't think it looks like what it looked like 3 years ago. But, like what's funny, it's funny because so probably good information for listeners know. So I left my job, earlier this year and decided to kind of completely disconnect from the boardroom, from work, like just like traditional kind of corporate marketing PR space, mostly because I felt like I just spent 10 and a half years in one single environment where I learned so much. But it was time to kind of put myself into a very different environment to learn in different ways that I believe will be just as applicable when I decide to jump back into things. But I have lots of friends who work as you naturally do because most people are. Um, and a lot of them working across different industries, tech and otherwise. And kind of what we always heard in 2020, which is like the new normal and work is never going to be the same, et cetera, et cetera. You're starting to hear a lot of executives kind of backtrack that on a little bit, and almost this feeling of trying to kind of, yes, that was a really crazy couple of years with the pandemic, like, but like let's start getting ourselves and massaging ourselves to be back into how we used to work. Mondays and Fridays can be at home, but like we really need everybody in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, which might not necessarily be a bad thing, but I can't help but think that it's actually just more of a default to what people know versus the reality of the world we are in and the future of the world and how we kind of create to future proof ourselves. So it's a long way of saying like I'm not entirely sure, but like what I do know is how do we start defining how technology has even changed and can enable better communication? And how do companies and teams start defining their value systems and what's most important to them for successful business? And then creating tactical approaches to where people are physically or how they interact and collaborate with their colleagues or. And I think everyone's kind of just going to that last step of like making these tactical decisions of how to work versus defining the philosophy of what their work needs to be successful in 2023 and beyond.
Okay, that was super helpful. Let's chunk this down a little bit because I agree with you. From the outside, you're looking at different organizations, and employees and employers have this tension between the two. It's in our face every day on the news, on LinkedIn, Instagram. There's just a lot of tension. I think you're right in terms of the tactical decisions without really the why behind it. It almost feels like it's just going through the motions just to go through the motions.
Well, I think the reality is the employer, there's power dynamics and everything in life, right? And the employer, the power dynamic leans to the employer. And so, or the leader or the CEO, whoever it might be. And that again, to the same point of like it being on the most senior person to create an environment of vulnerability and people to feel like they can provide feedback, it's also the responsibility of that person to be very clear on what success looks like and what values are most important to getting the work done in that company. And if companies are really clear on that and can define that and project that, then it allows individuals to self-select in, or it allows individuals to understand like, oh, this isn't actually a place for me. That to me is like the most crucial thing. And I even think you mentioned that even on an individual level, like me as a person, I need to be super clear on what value systems and the hierarchy of those values, how they play into my decision making so that I actually can be effective in understanding where I think I will thrive and where I want to thrive, and also just reality of just like trying to find that match around leaders, teams, companies, communities. You can kind of get really small or really big on that kind of topic.
When you said companies and teams define their values, do you have any examples that you could share with us?
So yeah, I do actually a recent personal one. So I mentioned that I am taking some time off, and the last few months I've started to explore what's out there, thinking through, do I want to do my own thing? Do I want to do startup? Do I want a big you have all those questions you kind of have to work through. And I was on LinkedIn and I saw a role that I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Like it's not exactly something I thought I would be interested in, but reading through it, I'm like, okay, cool. Geography wise, it was in a location that I was a little bit like, but like it was more of a tech driven company. Again, going back to kind of the future of work, how does remote play into it, et cetera, et cetera. And when I kind of started talking to them, it was very clear. I mean, they directly said it that location was a non negotiable, that everybody had to be based in that location, and we're actually always in the office Monday to Friday, which I think that was the first time I've heard that from anywhere. As we talked through it, I asked them questions about why that is. Like I'm curious of how you guys think about what's important to successful output, et cetera, et cetera. And like they were pretty clear on it, but they weren't precise in any of it. It just kind of felt like they just wanted people in the same location, which again, going back to your objectivity, I'm like, that's great. I'm very clear that location is an important aspect of your business. And most likely, not most likely, it is not in my top 3. Like, location just doesn't it's never mattered to me. I'm happy to move anywhere, I'm happy to be anywhere. And, ultimately just kinda walked away from it because it just was super clear to me that didn't think I would be able to be inspired the way I want to, lead the way I want to, but more importantly, I knew that the type of team I'd wanna hire, I would never be able to do it the way I wanted to. That to me was a non-negotiable. But I think that's my most recent, and it happened just a few weeks ago, example of kind of trying to figure out the values of a business and also understanding my alignment on that and how to make decisions that way.
I wrote something down earlier in this interview. You said create frameworks that drive objectivity. And I feel like that is almost what you're saying here too in terms of values. You as the individual define your values. Make sure that your employer and or boss and or industry really aligns with those values too. It's interesting too because you place yourself where you understand your values, you understand your own values, and then you place yourself in that position as to how you would be successful in that role. And you, the individual, can't be successful in that role with that given structure. So I appreciate the example because I know we're talking about going back to the office, but it could be any type of value, really.
Right. Well, and I think also the thing in for me and the mindset that I think is important to have in this exercise is nothing is absolutely right and nothing is absolutely wrong. And I think we can, you can slip into being like, I've been wronged or they don't get it. And maybe that's true. But again, like depending on what's important to a person, a company, a team, like there's probably very good reasons why somebody might make the choices they want to make. And so to me, I think it's really important to remember that like yeah, you know how you would want to do it and what you think is important, but that doesn't mean it's important to anybody else. And once you can kind of release yourself from that pressure almost, I think it actually just makes a lot of this stuff just easier for at least for me mentally, you know?
Right. I mean, you're giving us, I really appreciate this conversation, Anne, because you're giving us really concrete tools to unpack concepts that are pretty nuanced, subjective. There's a lot of nuance in leadership, there's a lot of subjectivity on how to build teams and get things done. But one of the core takeaways that I'm getting from you is that there's not necessarily a right way or a wrong way. It's just identifying those different strengths, assets, and values as an individual who really builds and makes up that collective team. This was such a great discussion. There's a lot to digest. One thing that I'd like you to leave us with, when I think about where we're at today as a workplace culture, we're hearing about a lot of layoffs. We're hearing a lot of buzzwords, the great resignation, quiet quitting. There's a lot of different generations in the workforce now with different technology skill sets. There's a lot of moving parts and pieces. And what I'd like to ask you is what is something you want to leave all of us with in terms of future of work, personal and professional development, and just how to keep our eyes on growth and moving forward?
Yeah, it's funny because I think things like quiet quitting, I feel like that's been a buzz topic for lots of business articles and likewise over the last few months. And it is it's interesting to look at the coverage because it kind of started out as kind of this empowerment for people and quickly kind of became like these people are doing bad things for business. And when I think about just all the things you just mentioned, we've had lots of generations in the workforces with lots of different levels of education and understanding forever. That's not new. All of these things are reactions to how we define the future of work and how we define what success looks like and how we get to that success. And it's not changing your bar, but it's actually realizing that that technology shift, that people shift, that people just even rethinking how they want to live their lives, how does that play into a leader or a company's ability to create for the people that are going to drive their business? One thing that I've been thinking a lot about too is, I one of the arguments for getting people back into desks at offices is, the up and coming generation, the people who are, 1 to 3 years into their careers or early in their careers, like they need to be developed and they need to be surrounded by people, and that's how they're going to grow, and that's how we developed, and that's how they need to develop. And I don't think that's wrong. I think you do need personal interaction, collaboration, bringing people together. But I do think it's also naive to think that the only way somebody is going to learn is if they're sitting right next to you at a desk 3 times, 4 times a week on, week out. And if I personally think about my early days, I started at Netflix when I was 24. And my job before that was also a remote job. My boss lived in Missouri and I lived in New Jersey. But at Netflix, like I was alone in kind of like our team pod a majority of the time, between people traveling or the fact that like lots of people had 2-hour commutes and they just they couldn't do it every single day. And what I learned was, how do I make sure that I'm asking for help? How am I using video? How am I using that phone? Because we actually use the phone a lot more then, to make sure you're having those connecting points. How do I make sure I ask what I need, and thinking through and struggling through that? And also, honestly, like when I think about that, like my team wasn't around. So like I had to go find the answers. Like I met so many engineers and just people all over the business because I had to just kind of go trial and error, and there's development in that too. So I share that because I think all this stuff is super nebulous, but again, if we just lean back on how we think things should work based on our history, and we really don't take into account what culture looks like today, there's going to be that disconnect between employers and employees until they start to kind of bring those two pieces together and actually find a common ground.
Well, Anne, thank you so much. Where can people follow along on your journey? Where can they find you?
LinkedIn is probably the best way. So Anne Wallin, and you should be able to find me there.
I can't wait to see what you build next.
Thanks, Sarah. It was really great to be here. I appreciate the conversation. It's been fun.
Thank you so much for listening to the Prospecting on Purpose podcast. If you loved what you heard today, subscribe to the podcast and please rate and leave a review. For more info on me, or if you'd like to work together, feel free to go to my website, saramurray.com. On social media, I'm usually hanging out at Sara Murray Sales. Thanks again for joining me, and I'll see you next time.